Also with us, Jonathan Turley, George Washington University law professor, constitutional law attorney, and Fox News contributor. Professor, it's great to have you on the show at all times. I'm wondering what you think about this. I was talking to Andy McCarthy and Jim Trusty, and the consensus seems to be not overly surprising. Do you share that view?
Well, we had been hearing some rumors about the possibility of this happening. There were also rumors with regard to Lee Zeldin. But the really unknown factor here is whether Todd Blanche is going to be the interim or whether he's really what the president is looking for. I think that while Democrats will view him something as a lightning rod because of his involvement in the Epstein files and their release, I think the president was likely impressed by his press conferences where he really gave no quarter to the media and he stood by the work of the Justice Department. So we'll have to see as this thing plays out what it is that the president is looking for. You know, Zeldin was a steady hand at the tiller at EPA. He produced, which is what this president really demands of everyone. I mean, he has the bona fides of bringing that agency into greater fiscal responsibility and refocusing its attention. So we'll learn very soon, I think, of which way the president is likely to head.
And some professor would even argue that when you're talking about Lee Zeldin at the EPA, not just did he produce, I mean, he's aggressive. You talk about going after some of these environmental regulations and pulling them back. And in place of that, being able to put forth a lot of these energy regulations that the president really, truly loves. So I think that's part of it. When you talk about going after what you want to achieve, Lee Zeldin is a role model for the president in that perspective. Do you agree?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I think Lee Zeldin is likely to be the preferred choice among GOP members, particularly senators, because of that record, and also because he's a known item. He cut his teeth in Washington. He knows how this city runs. Keep in mind, Zeldin came awfully close to becoming governor of New York. So this is someone who was able to come close to achieving what some people think is an impossibility, to have a Republican governor now of that state. It shows his crossover appeal that has made him a popular candidate on the Hill.
Yeah, from New York. I mean, the youngest lawyer in New York history at one time at 23 years old, 22 years in the military, lawmaker. I mean, yeah, you're talking about bona fides. He's got them. I'm wondering if you're surprised when you hear that Bill Malugin on Capitol Hill is like, hey, the Democratic lawmakers still want to go after Pam Bondi. They want her up on the Hill to testify.
Well, I think that is a factor in who the president selects. The Democrats have been running on the pledge of unleashing an apocalypse. They basically have said they will investigate all of Trump's supporters, not just President Trump. They've promised to impeach President Trump a third time and basically to convert the House into a 24/7 investigative unit of everything Trump. That's what the president could be well seeing after the midterms. So the question is, which of these attorney general candidates would be the best hand at the wheel through those choppy waters? Each of them, and there's a larger list than people suggest, have a skill set. You know, Zeldin's aggressive, but he also knows how to resolve fights, but he can end them. But, you know, Todd Blanche is someone who is a serious litigator. He was a top prosecutor. He was a top partner at a top firm. He is someone who doesn't even flinch in a fight. And the president saw that. I saw him in court when I covered the Trump trial for Fox. And I must tell you, I was very impressed. He's not a flashy guy. He's not flashy in court. He's not flashy outside the court. But he's lethal as a litigator. And then you've got other people on the list, like Judge Pirro, who has an association with this network, former judge, a U.S. attorney that I believe the president is delighted with. There are also state attorney generals. So he has a pretty deep bench. The benefit of Todd is that it would be a seamless transition. He could literally just walk across the hallway and take up this job.
Yeah, he very well could. Professor, great to have you on as always. Thank you. We appreciate it.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.